Great to see many of you again. I'm starting to recognize a lot of the faces, front row, second row, even the third row. And thanks to all you young people here from St. Francis. Apologize for my voice. I've been laid low by allergies. A lot of people think I'm like this super tough guy. I'm actually quite delicate. I'm going to talk today for just 25 minutes, maybe even up to half an hour, about mass incarceration in the United States, looked through the lenses of race, law, and economics. And then we're going to stop it and get into the Q&A, which is when things tend to get very interesting. Mass incarceration, what does that mean? You know, incarceration, we all know what that means. It means locking people up in prisons, jails, and what are called detention centers. Mass incarceration is when the incarceration rate gets to be very, very high. By really any standard, the incarceration rate in the United States, thank you again, Emily, is extremely high. It's the highest in the world right now. A lot of you are not in your head. You've heard that before. The incarceration rate in the U.S. is high by world historical terms. I mean, looking throughout human history. You can go to the legalist program of the Qin dynasty, which reunified China in 221 BCE. You can look at late imperial Rome from the 3rd to 5th centuries AD, and the peak Gulag USSR right after World War II. Those are our only points of comparison. And of course, this is very much at odds with our self-image as the land of the free, the homeland of freedom, Statue of Liberty, and all that good stuff. How did the land of the free get to be the world's greatest jailer and prison warden? Right now, the incarceration rate in the U.S. is 698 per 100,000 people. That's very, very high. Okay, there's a huge amount of variation among the 50 states, as you could probably guess, with the states of the former Confederacy leading the pack. You have Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oklahoma at the very top, locking up more than 1% of their populations. That's quite a bit. With Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas pretty close behind, all of them with incarceration rates rivaling the peak Gulag USSR. Think about that. And certainly well higher than the former East German satellite state of the USSR. How is it that our incarceration rate is, of a piece or a peer of these police states, totalitarian states of the 20th century? At the low end of the spectrum, you have Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont. These are low by U.S. standards, but the incarceration rates in these individual states are still double that of the United Kingdom, triple the rate in France, and over quadruple the rate in Germany. So even at our low end, places like Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Maine, you still have incredibly high incarceration rates compared to peer nations. Now, is mass incarceration a problem in itself? Not everyone thinks that it is. And I found that talking to people who are outside the liberal reform bubble of criminal justice work, a very common first reaction to these facts, to learning these facts, is, wow, I guess the rest of the world really needs to step up their prison game. I guess, Italy or Turkey or Greece or Colombia, they really need to maybe spend more money. Maybe if they had more money, they could spend more money and be more like us in the United States. That's a common first reaction. I see some excellent side eye in the second row. Thank you for that. That's a common first reaction, but once people think it over a bit, they tend to get beyond that and think, this is just a problem in itself. And no matter who we're locking up, it's a kind of civilizational failure to lock up that many people. Now, I'm not saying that's unanimous. You can find, jewels like what's the name for the senator from Arkansas, the young guy, Senator Tom, he's a Harvard Law graduate, bless him. Why is his name escaping my mind? I feel blessed that I can't think of his name, but I think, depending where you go in the United States, there's some, you'll find deep streaks of punitiveness, and maybe 1/10 or even 1/5 in some parts of the country are some, punitive little munchkins who are really eager to lock people up and think that's a good thing, a sign of our superior morality, a sign of how serious and tough we are. But more and more people, not just Democrats either, but Republicans, and not just North, but even in the South, in the former Confederacy, are starting to see this is a serious problem and something that needs to be rectified and undone. I think Tom Cotton, yes, thank you, I guess, for reminding me of that gentleman. For Tom Cotton, Republican senator, young guy, really embodies the best of Arkansas, the best of Harvard Law School, and one wonderful senator. He thinks that our problem is that we don't incarcerate enough people, even though we lock up the highest number in absolute terms and as a proportion of our society. And Tom Cotton, he's not alone. Not alone among Harvard Law graduates, not alone among people in the South or in New York either. I want to talk about how we look at this problem through the lenses of race, by which I really mean white racism, law, and economics. These are three very different categories. Each brings something essential to how we understand this very complex phenomenon. And each of these leaves some things out. And if you rely too much on each one of those, you can get a distorted image of the picture. I'm speaking here at a university today, and really my goal is just to see the problem clearly. If I'm speaking at a community somewhere, a community center somewhere, or at some public event, I might talk a little differently. But here in this university, I really want to focus today on just seeing the problem clearly, okay? First of all, I think it's fair to say that the single largest determinant of how we got to where we are with the world's highest incarceration rate is the American tradition and history of white supremacy enforced through violence. American punitiveness, whether in our policing or our courts or our prisons or even in the legal codes themselves, can't be fully understood without the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and what's come since then. Sometimes this historical tradition is just a little on the nose, by which, right in your face. Louisiana, which has one of the highest incarceration rates, their state penitentiary is on the site of a former slave plantation called Angola, so-called because that's where many of its slaves came from. Black men in bondage continue to farm that land, while mostly white guys on horseback are riding around supervising. It's like that William Faulkner line, the past isn't even past. The incarceration rate for black men in the U.S. is an astronomical 2,207 per 100,000. It's nearly 6 times the rate for white men, and higher than the rate for black men in South Africa under apartheid. In recent years, videos of lethal police violence against unarmed African Americans have become a constant on TV and virally shared online, making the problem very visible. How many of you have read the book, or at least heard of the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander? Okay, I see a lot of hands raised by the young and the old. Very important book that has been a galvanizing force. Not all books do that. And really changed the way we talk about mass incarceration. It's hard to believe it, but 20 years ago, when we also had the world's highest incarceration rate, in fact, it was higher then than it is today, this problem did not get as much attention. It was not seen as much as a problem. And you didn't have the kind of growing consensus, at least among elite opinion makers, that this is something we need to undo and transform. And her book deserves a lot of credit. And her argument is that the huge spike in incarceration in the US since the mid-70s is in a way a backlash against the gains of the civil rights movement. I think there's certainly some truth to that. There are also some flaws in her argument that I think point out the limits of seeing racism as the prime motor or the main engine behind mass incarceration. First of all, according to one very large empirical study by Michael Tonry and Matthew Malusky, this is from 2004, the data is not perfectly fresh, about 60% of the racial disparity in incarceration is accounted for by offending rates. Now, what I mean by that is that the murder rate, both among victims and perpetrators, is a lot higher in Black America than in white America. That's something that inside the liberal criminal justice reform subculture, people have a difficult time saying it. I know I certainly do when I'm teaching. I feel like I'm rubbing people's faces in it. But conservatives will not hesitate to serve that statistic back at you if you're playing outside the cozy intramural softball game of liberal to radical criminal justice reform. And it's important to keep that in mind. The higher murder rate and rates of violent crime inside Black America is really comparable to the higher murder rate and higher violent crime rate that you saw in Irish America 150 years ago, when Irish Americans were living disproportionately in dense urban poverty, just like Black America today is disproportionately living in regions of dense urban poverty. And it's a factor of that. There are some other flaws too, or limits to the Michelle Alexander analysis, which I think are important to look in the face, without dismissing the great value of that book. James Foreman Jr. wrote a wonderful, sympathetic, but critical review of this in the NYU Law Review, and he points out that in emphasizing mass incarceration's racial roots, the new Jim Crow writers overlook other critical factors. For instance, the steady rise in violent crime rates from 1960 to the early 90s. Also, the broad support for disciplinary overkill in overwhelmingly white places like Idaho and Wyoming, where even though there's not much of a Black population in these parts of the country or much of a civil rights movement there to have a backlash against, you still saw a huge increase in incarceration and a huge increase at the state level in tougher sentences, harsher policing in the same period. You also have solid support for many of these harsher policies, whether in policing or in sentencing, in Black-dominated cities and political units, for instance, Washington, D.C., which also has one of the highest incarceration rates in the country if it's taken on its own as a state. What we have now, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is a prison population that is 37% African American. I don't know if that seems shockingly low or shockingly high to people. I find that many people in New York or in northeastern cities are surprised that it's not higher than 37%. Part of that is bearing in mind that the United States is about 12.5% to 13% African American. And it's easy to lose sight of that if you live in Brooklyn, where it's about double that, or in New York, or in any other place that's less white, more multicultural, and more African American. Now, 37% African American prison incarceration rate is still very high. I mean, that's a triple overrepresentation compared to the overall population. But if we're locking up an enormous population that's 63% non-Black, I think we're talking about something more than collateral damage. We're talking about some things that are reaching beyond just a specific effort to punish Black people, specifically young Black men, and are having a widespread effect, although not as intense, on other demographics. So how do we close racial disparities in mass incarceration and criminal justice in general? And what does it mean? Well, I think we can all agree that racial disparities are bad. We should live in an equal country, an equality where people are all treated with equal respect. But there's still some questions about what it means to close a racial gap. Do we level up or do we level down? How many of you read The Onion? Do you know this online journal of news? I see a lot of hands. One of the greatest Onion stories of all time is white young woman to be tried, criminally prosecuted as black man. And there was a graphic that goes with it. And that just shows, I mean, the expectation, and it's a rational expectation, is that a young white woman will be treated with kid gloves compared to a black man by the criminal justice system. But how do we level that disparity that The Onion points out? By treating everyone as harshly as the system treats black men, or by treating everyone with the same lenience that the system tends to treat upper class white people, middle class younger white women, or celebrities, sports heroes. There's often a huge outcry when the system gives some leniency to someone with a lot of money, a celebrity, an athlete. You see this recently with the charges dropped against Jussie Smollett in Chicago, which apparently some people think is the most serious policing scandal in Chicago in decades, which is, if you know what's been going on in Chicago, everything from police torture to police shootings is a bit of a stretch. I mean, it's, if not downright ridiculous. It may seem obvious that the way to close racial disparities in how the criminal justice system treats people is, of course, to treat everyone decently. But that is not everyone's answer. Look at what happened in the state of Minnesota in 1992, where some impact litigation went up to the Minnesota's state Supreme Court, pointing out that the sentencing disparity between crack cocaine possession and powder cocaine possession was racist. That there were harsher sentences for people caught with crack cocaine than for people caught with powder cocaine. And since it was white people who were more likely to be caught with powder cocaine and face a lenient sentence, and it was black people who were more likely to be caught with crack cocaine and face a harsher sentence, that there was definitely a racist disparity there. And there certainly was. How do you think Minnesota then closed the gap? Oh, they made them the same, but did they bring them down or bring them up? Yeah, they brought them up. They decided they're going to treat everyone like young black men caught with crack. Now, that's certainly equality, but is it just, or is it an equality of injustice, an equality of misery? I think we need to always push for equality of decency and treatment, and to always level up, not down. And to always, you know, referring to that Onion story again, try to treat everyone the same way celebrities get treated, the way, you know, a young white woman from an upper middle class background might be treated by the system, rather than treating everyone with the same harshness, the way we treat young black men and young black women too. How do we end the racist nature of the criminal justice system? There are a lot of viewpoints on this. I mean, one viewpoint is that you have to destroy racism at the root, that you have to first change people's heads and change people's hearts, and only then can you reform the criminal justice system, its laws and institutions. One set of policies that goes along with this diagnosis is implicit bias training, that we all have implicit racism to some degree, like a virus, and if we can just get proper training through administered by professionals, that we can all lose this. I think this is worth examining seriously because it's a very serious problem. But those people who have studied it seriously have found that implicit bias training really doesn't do much. That if anything, it inspires resentment among police. And I have one friend, Alex Vitale, who's come here a few times, who compares it, he calls it the F-35 of criminal justice reform. The F-35 is this overpriced boondoggle fighter jet that our government has flushed tons of money away on. And to say that doesn't mean that there's no other solution, but I think we might be better off looking at how to do away with racism in the criminal justice system through the other way around. Only by changing laws and institutions will we be able to change people's heads. I don't think there's going to be a big anti-racism rapture that will suck all the racism up into, or I guess down into hell, and then leave us, free of racism and then ready to start. I think it's only by serious institutional and legal reforms first that we're going to change people's heads. Even if these reforms might be on their face, not race specific. Some of you have heard of bail reform, okay? Bail reform, a very serious reform measure, some version of it I think just passed in Albany or is on the verge of. Very important for keeping people out of prison, for trying to prevent the next Khalif Browder atrocity from happening. This would have a very disproportionate effect, I think, on Black America, because young black people are much more likely to be sucked into that system than white people. But on its face of the law, it's racially neutral. There's nothing about race in the language of bail reform, in most bail reform laws. And yet I think it would be much more effective than giving all police or all parole officers implicit bias training. We found that implicit bias training can result in a leveling down. There was some recent reporting on an implicit bias training program administered to police in Utah, I think in Salt Lake City. And what the reporter got out of it was that the police, after leaving it, were kind of excited to start treating elderly white women the same way they treat young black men. Again, that's how they were overcoming their biases. Well, how about we treat everyone like elderly white women? And maybe that's the answer, with the same kind of respect, that elderly, all people deserve. Black Lives Matter is a huge and important development in the criminal justice reform push and subculture in the United States. It's opened up a lot of space for other reformers to move into. It's less a single, organized, coherent movement than a constellation of small organizations. It's a slogan, it's a mindset, very important. If you watched Fox News, you would think Black Lives Matter is one of the most dominant, organizations in the U.S. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I think the importance is amplified and inflated as a kind of threat inflation by the far-right media of Fox News and elsewhere. But the actual force is, still growing and not as huge as it might be. But it's, growing and getting better. Moreover, I think that if we see mass incarceration as predominantly an issue afflicting Black America, that may have a perverse effect of having non-Black people check out of the issue and saying, okay, well, it's your problem then. If this is predominantly and overwhelmingly an issue affecting Black people, Black men, well, then it's not the problem of Latinos, it's not the problem of white people, it's not the problem of Asian Americans. So it's essential to maintain some kind of multiracial coalition in all this. The onus, I think, is always on the white majority to, be a team player there, and we haven't always in the past. Let me move to law. There's a lot of excitement about legal reform, changing the laws, changing criminal procedure. That's important. Who can doubt? We're a very legalistic country. As Madison wrote, we're a nation of laws, not a nation of men. Verfassungspatriotismus is as American as apple pie or handguns. And this country's intelligentsia has always been dominated by lawyers, as Tocqueville noticed a long time ago. We see the legal mindset take charge in a few causal explanations for mass incarceration. One is in sentencing. The idea that all we need to do is shorten sentences, and then we will end mass incarceration. The other is in criminal procedure, particularly in searches, seizures, and stops in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, that if we just manipulate that, tighten it up, then we will be able to fix the system. I don't think either one gets us nearly as far as we need to go in emptying our prisons and transforming criminal justice and our social order in general. According to John Paff, who I think has been here a few times, the imposition of longer sentences is certainly harsh, certainly awful, certainly part of the puzzle of why we have so many people locked up in prison for a long time. But you don't have the huge spike in incarceration until years after these long sentences have been imposed. And that has something to do with more than just, that taking time to take effect and our prisons filling up and not letting out, looking at the fluid dynamics. Also, criminal procedure. We had the rights revolution, as it's called, after World War II, with a liberal, relatively progressive Supreme Court putting new limits on police, the Earl Warren Court, expanding the rights of citizens against police power and state power. And this peaks in the late 60s. Cases like Gideon v. Wainwright, which guaranteed the right to defense counsel from 1963, Mapp versus Ohio, limiting what evidence can be used if it's obtained through improper or illegal searches by police a year earlier. And yet, soon after the rights revolution culminates in the late 60s, you have the incarceration rate spike and go up, where it stays until around 10 years ago when it starts to plateau and go down slightly. This is the exact opposite, of course, of what you would expect. You would expect, I would anyway, that these limits on police power would lower the incarceration rate, would almost guarantee that criminal defendants have more power. We find, however, that the right to counsel, for instance, is very hollow. First of all, what percentage of criminal cases today even go to trial when a counsel is especially important? Anyone know? How are the great majority of criminal cases resolved?
Plea bargaining.
Plea bargaining, yeah. Plea bargaining. So that's about 95%. And of the 5% that remain, well, you have overworked public defenders, and sometimes court-appointed lawyers who aren't even professional criminal defense lawyers, 18Bs. We find this is totally inadequate, that there's some respect for law and legal procedure, but respect for law and procedure is very different from respect for people and respect for individuals. And the answer of many legally minded people, whether law professors or legislators, a great many of whom have law degrees, seems to always be more law, more legal procedure. That's not enough. You need changes of a fundamentally different order. There's a great article by Paul Butler called Poor People Lose. It's publicly available online, all about the hollowness of Gideon v. Wainwright and the hollowness of the right to counsel. And I say that, not to disrespect the work of public defenders who are doing the best they can with huge caseloads. But still, we need something more than more rights, more law. We need a substantive change in criminal justice and to get beyond this proceduralism. I think that's also true about search and seizure law. I think that has something to do with the war on drugs and the nabbing and incarceration of many nonviolent drug offenders. What percentage of our prison population is a nonviolent drug offender? Anyone want to guess? Just shout something out. I'm not going to hold you to it. 75. Sorry? 70%, 50%, I hear. That's the image that you get often from the liberal criminal justice reform movement, which has sprouted its own folklore. It's a lot smaller than that. It's more about 15%. And if you take the stand, this is kind of where most of the Democratic Party is today. They'll publicly say, we need to just release nonviolent drug offenders, but impose harsher penalties for violent crimes, serious crimes. If that's what you believe, then the system will not change at all. And we will continue to have the world's highest incarceration rate. And, you know, that point of view is mass incarceration's best friend. A bare majority, about 55% of people in state prisons, which is where about 80 to 85% of our total prisoners are in for crimes of violence. Okay, now violent offenses, that covers a lot of ground. That could be serious things like homicide, rape, aggravated assault, but it can also be, in some jurisdictions, robbing a building, okay, or burgling, or snatching a purse that's on a chair. It can mean a lot of things. And we really have to take a hard look at how we are over-punishing violent crime. And again, there's a false dichotomy between the harshness of our present system and not doing anything. I don't think anyone's advocating no response whatsoever. But I think there's a growing realization that we are over-punishing crimes of violence. And that we need to think of a better way to do that. Long sentences for assault, for instance, or other aggravated, do not increase the deterrent power of those sentences. Okay? Once you are giving a certain sentence, say 5, 6 years, beyond that, there's zero additional deterrent power. So it's not like these incredibly harsh sentences that we serve, harsher than in any peer nation, are serving as some wonderful deterrent. We still have much more violent crime than Canada, Germany, Australia. But they are responsible for locking more people up. So I think we have to look beyond law a little bit and not let lawyers, law professors, and legislators with law degrees thinking that legal reform by itself will do everything. Anyone here have family in the Dominican Republic? Come from there? Okay. The Dominican Republic launched a huge criminal justice reform effort where they completely revamped their criminal court system, changed to an adversarial system like we did, but starting in 2007, I believe, and changed their prisons to major legal reform there. In the course of this, they have almost doubled their incarceration rate. So legal reform doesn't automatically mean, a nicer, gentler social order based more on mutual consent, dignity, and respect. It can also lead up to ratcheting up the incarceration rate, as has happened in the Dominican Republic, which I bring up as a close-by example. And as an object lesson, really, of a path that we don't want to go down. So it takes more than just changing the laws. Let's talk about economics. You should always follow the money. I mean, that's the motto of Wall Street Journal reporters, of Marxists, of really anyone. You should always follow the money. Two of the biggest myths sprouted by the reform culture in the United States, criminal justice reform culture, is that prison labor is a major source of income for states and kind of a secret engine of mass incarceration, and also that private prisons are really the problem and the engine behind mass incarceration, right? I hear that all the time, even from people who are law professors but working in a different part of the law. Neither one is true or remotely true. Now, it's true that prison labor is not what it should be in the United States, but it is not a huge secret source of income for the state of California, the state of New York, or the federal government. Many prisoners do want to work. They do want to learn a skill, but that work needs to be paid a proper wage, and there should be some labor rights, even for prison workers. That's one more way that we should treat prisoners like humans rather than dehumanized beings that we're just stripping of all rights and dignity. Prisoners, as you may know, work 30 to 40% of the firefighting jobs, fighting wildfires in California, making just $1 a day, great many of them women. And that strikes a lot of people, something that should, get those prisoners out a little earlier if they're performing a vital civic function like this. I'll refer you to the work of one formerly incarcerated person, Chandra Bozelko, Bozelko, about how important it was for her to work in prison, even though she made only $1.75 a day. The thing to change here is to make sure prison labor is treated with dignity and that people make more than $1.75 a day and learn real skills and have real rights on the job. That's true outside of prisons too, and there's not enough dignity of labor in the United States. What about private prisons? A few years ago, there was a talk between David Simon, creator of The Wire, former criminal justice reporter in Baltimore, and then President Barack Obama, where they agreed that private prisons really need to be limited. They're the cause of this. Private prisons, anyone want to guess what percentage of our total incarcerated population is held in private prisons? Just take a guess. I'm not going to hold you to it. 15? 50? 55? 5. Yeah, it's close between 5 and 10. I guess you guys have heard this already, or hip to this. It's very small. I mean, it's growing, and there's certainly problems, special problems with private prisons and a profit incentive to incarcerate people. But this is a small number. Now, the huge economics of our prison system, it's not just in private prisons, but it's in all the money spent on corrections officers working in state prisons, mostly, and to a lesser degree, federal prisons. The total annual amount spent on corrections is $81 billion. And that's bigger than the annual gross domestic product of over 100 nations of the world. If you add courts and policing costs, that's another $100 billion. That's a total of $182 billion a year. Now, the two biggest private prison firms were only pulling in $2.5 billion in 2012. Maybe even double that by now. But that, say, $5 billion is still a lot less than the $182 billion. So it's a very small part of the pie. That doesn't mean that economic pressure this way and that isn't a huge part of this still. Corrections officers are a permanent lobby for more prisons and keeping people in prisons. These are often public sector unions. And I say that not to condemn all unions. I'm a proud member of the United Auto Workers myself. They get me a good wage at NYU as an adjunct professor. But there has to be a way to engage the public sector unions to tamp down this enthusiasm among corrections officer unions for prisons. And I'm talking about public prisons, not private prisons. There's a lot of interesting structural analysis of American punishment in the context of a neoliberal political economy that's well worth reading. Authors like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Christian Parenti, Loic Wacquant, and looking at, even though the government has receded from the economy, cut back many social services, many public services since the mid to late 70s, the government has expanded its penal services and expanded spending on policing, prisons, prosecutors. And that goes against the idea of a neoliberal state receding, leaving more things to the free market spaghetti monster. You have a real expansion of the punitive state and its very invasive and harsh tentacles into everyday life in the United States. Now, many had hoped that with the onset of the Great Recession of 2008, that tightened public budgets would automatically lead to much lower incarceration rates and less gratuitous punishment. That there would be an immense opportunity to find ground between Republican fiscal conservatives to shrink the punitive state apparatus in the name of austerity. It hasn't really worked out that way, though. There's been some drop and mild decline in incarceration, but not a steep drop. First of all, fiscal conservatism doesn't get you much meaningful reform. in New York State, for instance, we're about 30% down from our peak incarcerated population. That's pretty good news. I mean, 30% decline is significant. I mean, if I get a 30% pay cut, I'm pissed. If I get a 30% pay increase, I'm happy. It's still extremely high and should be looked at as something, that's an abomination, but 30% cut is bigger. Even with this 30% cut in the number of prisoners in New York State, spending on the prison system has remained constant. Okay, why is that? Powerful lobbies among corrections officers. It's politically unpopular to close a prison in a place like Newburgh or other upstate places where a lot of jobs have vanished, where you've had deindustrialization, and working at the state prison is one of the few jobs nearby that pays a good wage with union protections. So it's very politically unpopular to do that. Moreover, you only get real savings in trimming the prison population, not if you, say, empty out a prison by 25%. The overhead costs are still enormous. You really have to shut down entire prisons. Otherwise, you still have the big overhead costs. Now, this shouldn't be the only metric. We actually should be spending more money per prisoner to guarantee that they have some dignity, appropriate services, medical care, healthy food, the rehabilitation services. And I say that, with always keeping in mind that the best way to reform a prison is to close it completely and, find something else to do, for young people and even older people instead of putting them in prison. Those two, tendencies can exist at the same time. But we can't really count on economic downturns to discipline the punitive state. We found historically that even in times of economic recession, even severe recession, the government is happy to expand the corrections budget and the policing budget. I think really you have to look at budgets, okay, and force budgets into the spotlight here. As one early 20th century Austrian sociologist, Rudolf Goldschmidt, said, "The budget is the skeleton of the state, stripped of all misleading ideologies." And what that means is sometimes you just have to hit the mute button, not listen to the verbiage coming out of our political class, but look at where they're spending money. It was extremely disappointing to me to see that our progressive mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, backed by our progressive city council, led by Melissa Mark Viverito, Jumaane Williams, etc., all backed hiring 1,297 new police officers amid record low crime. Think about that. If you have record low crime in the city, why are you spending this discretionary budget that you have to add more police officers? Police union, okay, wants more people. That's one pressure point. I think that's part of it, but I think there's the lack of political vision. And where there is no vision, the people perish, to coin a phrase. Where there is no vision for using that money to hire, people, social workers to help homeless people, to build social housing, to spend it on mental health care, to spend it on youth job programs where youth can learn skills and get the mentorship and training they need, to encourage their aspirations rather than more police, more police, more police. Can New York City ever stop hiring more police officers? I mean, it's like an addiction. And again, I want to point out this wasn't the wicked Republican Rudy Giuliani who did it, or even the half-wicked independent Mike Bloomberg who did it. This was Bill de Blasio, backed by the Progressive City Council, who, given the chance, with a lot of money, spent it on more police officers. There needs to be a new vision, and I think that comes from all of us hassling our elected officials more and spreading this and making sure that they spread it too. Those are three lenses of looking at mass incarceration. Each has their limits. Each is also utterly essential. I don't mean to downplay the importance of racism or of law itself, God knows, or of economics. But here at St. Francis University today, or St. Francis College, excuse me, I just want to talk for a day about how we can see the problem clearly in 3 dimensions. Let's break for Q&A and we can talk more about this complex and urgent problem.
When you asked about privatization, I threw out the number 50% because I see more and more stories in the paper about privatization of prisons and hospitals and policing and everything else. And I was wondering if that was one of the factors that was driving or not driving harshness and the rate and everything else.
You know, I think stepping back from it, I don't think it's privatization of prisons specifically. I think it's privatization overall of the neoliberal economy, where the state is stepping back from providing basic services that it used to, or at least aspired to, and leaving people on their own. So, you know, state stepping back from job training, from a goal of full employment, and that comes with privatization. But it's not prisons exactly.
For example, I'm from Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
and so do you think with Ron not being running there anymore and a new head in the police department, I knew that because they changed it recently. Do you think that controlling, separating gun control laws will be probably a decrease in that as well? Do you think maybe taking apart other little things can make it see the bigger picture of the long-term one?
You know, I don't follow Chicago as closely as I should. You know, you've had spike and recently a decline in the homicide rate there. For some reason, the decline in the homicide rate in Chicago it comes as bad news to a lot of people. They're disappointed. Why? It should be great news, but a lot of people, it's like taking their candy away. They don't have that. What I would do if I were replacing Rom, you got to spend more money on mental health, on expanding Medicaid, all healthcare services, and on youth job programs. That costs money. You get that money by taxing the rich. Be upfront about that. That's where you spend the money. Not building a new police training academy. Not spending more money on police, all that. There's been an inspiring movement in Chicago led by a lot of young people, some older people too, to stop the motion to fund a new training police academy and to put that money into other services. If criminal justice reform means anything, it's not adding new technology and toys and training to police departments. It means transferring massive amounts of budget and authority, power, away from police, prosecutors, and prison, and putting that into totally different arms of government. Public health, housing, full employment. That's the kind of big structural fix you need. And you need a vision to do that, a political vision. Decriminalizing drugs, that means not only stop enforcing the drug, but you have to build up and fund a public health system that can deal with drug addiction. Okay, that's not, these special drug courts, which were a really cutting edge idea 30 years ago, but have really outlived their usefulness. You need it completely outside of the justice system. And that's where Chicago should be going. We'll see if they go there.
I think it was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when New York led the pack in closing mental health facilities. And I think our crime rates started going up, and now many prisons are really babysitting
Yeah.
health problems. My question is, Canada, Australia, that have a lower male population, do they treat their mental health situations differently from us?
I'm not going to, BS you and tell you I know the details of this important question. But first of all, the biggest institution for the mentally ill in the United States is the Cook County Jail in Chicago. That's not right. Of course, police are obviously not trained or equipped. And one vision of of criminal justice reform is, okay, well, the police should just hire some nurses and social workers to be at the prison. No, you need to take it outside the jail and outside the criminal justice system completely. Different bureaucracy, a different arm of government. One model that's pointed to frequently is northern Italy. Franco Basaglia was a radical psychiatrist who took over some very harsh mental institutions that were very penal and very punitive in character, kind of democratized them. He didn't just let people out, it just changed the way these were run, set up some community care. You can't just do that, though, without setting up the mental health infrastructure outside, though. I mean, I think what we need to do is shift investment and shift our funding priorities away from the jails and prisons and put it into local community care that's not penal, not punitive. Of course, that's undoing on the one hand and building a whole institutional infrastructure on the other hand. That's not easy to do. It's ambitious, but I think it's the only way we can, treat people with mental illness with dignity.
85% of the crimes are committed by violent criminals, and about 50% by the non-violent. But it seems to me, and I want to correct my belief, that many of the non-violent criminals serve more time in jail than the ones who commit the violent crime. So what is the comparison with that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just restate the fact. In state prisons, it's about 55% of the people who are in for violent offenses. And that's defined very broadly in ways that will probably surprise every one of us. About 15% in for nonviolent drug crimes, and then you have the remainder in for property crimes of some kind, stealing a car, for instance, or I'm sure you can find examples of people in for nonviolent drug offenses. I mean, you can find people who are doing life sentences for nonviolent drug offenders, because the federal law is very harsh. If the drug is over a certain amount, over a certain threshold, the judges have zero discretion. And, people can end up doing life for nonviolent petty offenses like that. We have about 3,000, maybe, at least 2,500 people doing life for nonviolent offenses, doing life without possibility of parole.
You mean New York or the United States?
In the United States. Now, part of this is because of harsh federal drug laws. Part of it's because of state repeat offender laws, where you'll get someone who shoplifts 3 belts, and that's his multiple offense, and the value of the belts was over $100. That could be life for him, and so yeah, that's a problem. We're over punishing nonviolent crimes. I think we're also over punishing violent crimes frequently. A lot of people simply age out of violence. The great majority of violent crimes are committed by young men between 15 and 33. Many prisons, both state and federal, are turning into nursing homes. And, there needs to be kind of a much more vigorous use of compassionate release to let elderly people out of prison, even if they've committed crimes of violence. Speaking of clemency, we need to see categorical amnesty, commutations, sweeping, not this bean counter stuff that Obama did, and not the weird game show stuff that the current commander-in-chief is doing, where he's, making a lot of hoopla and media attention for releasing a few offenders who are mediagenic, but really his record on commutations and clemency is worse than Obama's. But to finish with your question, most of the time people who are doing time for crimes of violence are doing more time than nonviolent. I mean, you can find some anomalies and they're grotesque, but overall it's still violent offenses that get people a longer sentence.
I'm curious where probation fits in this. I know it's a separate department, but do people argue that probation is more effective than prison, so therefore we should have shorter sentences and longer probation, or probation and no sentencing, or just sentencing and no probation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two. First, that important question of how do you get the ratio right of prison time to probation is important itself, but it has to be seen in the broader context of how do you prevent people from going into either one? How do we spend our government budget in a way to make sure people don't wind up in the criminal justice system at all? Because there's a tendency when you get softer forms of punishment, like probation, to then widen the net. okay, and capture more people. And say, oh, well, we're not sending, little Johnny to prison, it's just probation. But then if Johnny flunks his urine test or whatever, where is he going back? It's still a criminal record. There needs to be a better way to just do society than having the criminal justice system rule over people and order our collective life. So I just want to say that bigger question always has to be in the background and very visible in the background and shaping how we view the medium-sized question. I'm not saying it's a small question of punishment, incarceration versus probation.
You mentioned age being a factor to let out prisoners out of their sentencing. Why is that? Like, the older you are, you should get released right away.
Yeah, for two reasons. First of all, elderly people are much lower offense risk for reoffending, especially for violent crimes. That's just a sociological fact that most violence is committed by young men between 15 and 33. So there's lower risk, okay? You're not endangering society. And second, many of these people have been in for a long time. Their sentences are incredibly harsh. Much harsher than they used to be in the United States. In some ways we've grown milder and more tolerant as a society, but as far as criminal sentencing goes, we've gotten much harsher in many ways. I mean, even a typical murder sentence in Texas would have only been about 15 years 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Now it's life. And even taking into account the harshness of crime, letting people out.